I'm excited to introduce Kim Scott. Kim has worked at Google and Apple and has advised CEOs, including at Twitter, which I'm sure was an experience. And Kim has, among other things, also worked at a Russian diamond cutting factory, which also sounds interesting. But that's not what she's here to talk with us about. You can see what that is about: creating a healthy, vibrant workforce culture. And without further ado, I will welcome Kim on stage.
Thank you all so much. It's great being back here with you all. I'm gonna talk for just a couple of minutes about radical candor in addition to just work. Radical candor is a really simple idea, and when you all put it into practice, it'll help you build companies in which everyone can do the best work of their lives, and even more importantly, from my perspective, build the best relationships of their career. However, I also want to talk to you about just work. If you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of it. And indeed, I did. And some of the feedback that I got led me to write just work. But first of all, radical candor. What is radical candor? I think I may have the wrong clicker, so maybe somebody can bring me the right clicker. Oh, yeah. There were two clickers up here. So radical candor, it simply means caring personally and challenging directly at the same time. And when you do both of those things at the same time, do you have another clicker for me? Thank you. That is radical candor. Now that hardly seems, caring and challenging hardly seem so radical that I would call it radical candor. And yet, I've worked with a lot of different leaders, and not a single one of them has said, oh, feedback is easy for me. Feedback is so, all of life's hardest problems can be boiled down to a good 2x2 framework. So here is your feedback framework. Care personally, challenge directly at the same time. Now, why is it so hard? Let's give some, in order to make it a little bit easier, one of the things I've done is to give words to what happens when we fail on one dimension or another. So sometimes we challenge directly, but we forget to show that we care personally. And this I call obnoxious aggression. Now, in the first version of the book, I called this the asshole quadrant because it seemed, I don't know, a little bit more radically candid. But I stopped doing that for a really important reason. I found that when I did that, people would use this framework as an excuse to act like a garden variety jerk. I'd find people would walk into a room and they'll say, in the spirit of radical candor, and what they really meant was in the spirit of obnoxious aggression. They would also use this framework like another Myers-Briggs personality test. So I beg of you, please don't use this framework that way. Use this framework like a compass to guide specific conversations with specific people to a better place. Now, there's a bunch of problems with obnoxious aggression. One, of course, is that it hurts the very people who you're depending on to get great work done. The second is that when you hurt people, you put them in fight or flight mode, and so they literally cannot hear what you're saying. You're wasting your breath. It's inefficient. But there's a third, more subtle problem with obnoxious aggression, and this stems from the fact that most of you are very nice people. And when you realize, like when I realized that I have been a jerk, when I realize I've acted like a jerk, it is my instinct not to go the right way on care personally, but instead to go the wrong way on challenge directly. And then I wind up in the very worst place of all, manipulative insincerity. This is where passive-aggressive behavior, political behavior, all of the things that make a workplace most toxic creep in. If obnoxious aggression is front-stabbing, manipulative insincerity is backstabbing. And these two quadrants are where the drama creeps in. If you watch Silicon Valley, the HBO show, if you watch The Office, you're going to see a lot of episodes about these two behaviors, obnoxious aggression and manipulative insincerity. But the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of us make the vast majority of our mistakes in this last quadrant, where we do remember to show that we care personally, because it turns out, despite everything we read on social media, most people are actually pretty nice people. So we do remember to show that we care personally, but we're so concerned about not hurting someone's feelings that we fail to tell them when they're making a mistake that they need to know about. And this I call ruinous empathy. So this is pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and yet it's so counterinstinctive. It's about a fundamental behavior change. And the best thing you can do to change your behavior and your team's behavior is to boil this down to a simple order of operations. So there's 4 things to keep in mind. The first is to start with soliciting radical candor. Don't dish it out until you prove you can take it. If you want to create an environment of psychological safety, you have to make sure your team knows that it is safe to tell you the truth. Andy Grove, when he was the CEO of Intel, used to say that the snow melts at the periphery. And when you are the leader of your company, you are the last to know when the snow is melting because it's happening at the periphery. And if you don't take very active steps to make sure that people, and it's not just a matter of making people feel comfortable telling you the truth, because they will never feel comfortable telling you the truth. You've got to make sure that you are actively soliciting, and not just soliciting, but rewarding the truth when you get it from people. So that's the first step. Always starts with, if all of you think about, and if you ask people, do you have any feedback for me? You're wasting your breath. I can already tell you the answer. Oh no, everything's fine. So you want to think about the active steps you can take to get people to tell you the truth and then to reward it when you get it. Next, you have to give it. And remember, radical candor is not only about criticism. It's even more about praise than it is about criticism. Your job as leaders is to paint a picture of what's possible. And it turns out that praise is a much better tool than criticism for doing that. But of course, you got to do both. And don't use praise as the way you show you care personally, and criticism as the way you challenge directly. Both praise and criticism have got to do both for it to be radical candor. Next, you've got to gauge it. Radical candor gets measured not at my mouth, but at your ear. Not at the speaker's mouth, but at the listener's ear. And so it's crucial that you understand how what you're saying is landing for the other person, and you adjust. If there were such a thing as emotional Novocaine, I promise I would give it to you, but there isn't. You just have to adjust. If the person is sad or mad, move up on the care personally dimension. If the person is brushing you off, if the person is ignoring what you're saying, that's your cue to move out further than you may be comfortable going on the challenge directly dimension. So choose the right vector on the framework. And last but not least, you want to encourage it. You want to encourage radical candor. This is how you get your leverage. You build a culture of radical candor. Most important thing you can do here is you need to make sure that you are preventing backstabbing on your team. When you are the leader, people come to you. One person's going to come to you and talk to you about someone else. And it's tempting to think that you're being an empathetic leader to listen. This is the one time when you should not listen as a leader. You got to go get that person to talk to the person directly. Unless, of course, it's sort of a dramatic HR violation. But if it's a normal business confrontation, you've got to get people talking to each other directly rather than coming to you. Because if you listen, all you're doing is stirring the political pot. So you need, and when they can't, then you got to follow up. Did you resolve it? If they didn't resolve it, you've got to bring the two of them in your office together. This feels awkward, but it feels sort of almost juvenile. It feels like you're the principal bringing people in. You got to overcome that awkwardness. If you don't do it, then that conflict will permeate your whole organization. It'll be clear to every employee in your organization, and it'll make itself manifest in the products that you're building. I was at a tech company in San Francisco about a couple of months after Radical Candor came out, giving this presentation. Here's the feedback. Here's the feedback that led to Just Work. And the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade, a person who I liked and respected enormously. And she's one of too few black women CEOs in tech. And after I gave the presentation, she pulled me aside and she said, "Kim, I'm excited about Radical Candor, but I gotta tell you, it's much harder for me to put it into practice than it is for you." And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer anyone even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, she would get slimed with the angry black woman stereotype. And I knew this was true, and as soon as she said it to me, I had 4 revelations at the same time. The first was that I had not been the kind of colleague that I imagine myself to be, that I want to be. I had failed even to notice the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant at every meeting we had ever been in together, even though she had what I knew in that period of time to be pissed off about, as we all do at work. But she wasn't allowed to show it. And I had not even noticed. Not only had I been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to her, I realized, the second realization I had was that I had been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to me as a woman in the workplace, especially in tech. And this was because I think I never wanted to consider myself to be a victim. I was in denial, kind of a hard thing for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit. But even more deeply than being in denial about the things that had happened to me, because I never wanted to think of myself as a victim, I even more didn't want to think of myself as a perpetrator. And so I was even more deeply in denial about the kinds of mistakes I had made, the kinds of things I had done or said that harmed the people who I work with. And last but not least, the 4th revelation was that I realized as a leader, I had failed to create the kinds of environments, even though I had intended to, I had failed to create the kinds of environments in which everyone could just work. Just in the justice sense of the word, but also just in the just get shit done sense of the word. So let's take a look at the role that we all play and what we can do to create the kinds of environments that we all want to create, where everyone who we hire can just work. Sometimes each one of you is going to be the person who's been harmed by some kind of unfairness at work. And your role, your job there, your responsibility there is to choose a response, not to default to silence. Sometimes we all play the role of the people who cause harm, unfortunately. And your role, when you're in this, which is, for my money, the most uncomfortable role, your responsibility is to listen to the feedback. This is the most difficult feedback to take on board that you get, that you've harmed someone. Listen to it and address it. Sometimes we play the role of upstander, hopefully not the silent bystander. There, your responsibility is to intervene. And last but not least, you're all the leader. Here, it's your job to prevent this stuff from happening, but of course, it's inevitable that it's going to happen. That's the joy of being a leader. It's your job to prevent the inevitable. So at the very least, when it does happen, despite your best efforts, it's your job to make sure that you are responding in a way that prevents it from happening again. Alan Eustace, who was a senior engineering leader at Google, used to do this thing on his teams where he would say, if you're underrepresented along any dimension and you've experienced some kind of unfairness in the last week, raise your hand. 100% of the people raised their hand. And he said, all right, put your hand down. He's talking to about 5,000 people. And then he would say, all right, if you have been unfair to one of your colleagues in the last week, raise your hand. Nobody raised their hand. And he said, you see the problem? We cannot fix problems we refuse to notice. So I think one of the things that can help us to fix the problem is to define unfairness, to define fairness more succinctly, and to break it down into its component parts. The best way to solve a problem is to break it down into its component parts. So here are what, for me, are the root causes of workplace injustice: bias, prejudice, and bullying. And I think the issue here is that we often conflate these 3 things as though they're one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break them apart. I'm going to offer some overly simplistic definitions. Bias is just not meaning it. It's kind of a mental hiccup. It's not even really a belief. Whereas prejudice is a very consciously held belief. It's meaning it. And bullying, there's no belief, conscious or unconscious. It's just being mean. So what can we do to respond to each of these things? Because once we break them apart, it becomes easier to know how to respond. And each one of these attitudes and behaviors demands a very different response. So first of all, bias. Aileen Lee, who started Cowboy VC, tells a great story where she is going into a room into a meeting with two colleagues who are men. And they sit down at a long conference table, and then the other side files in. The first person comes in and sits across from the guy to Aileen's left. The next person comes in and sits across from the guy to his left. Then they file on down the table, leaving Aileen dangling by herself. And this is often how bias shows up, just in who we choose to sit next to. And Aileen had the skills that was going to win her team the deal, so she started talking. And when the other side had questions, they directed them at her two colleagues who were men, not at Aileen. Anybody ever seen that happen? Happened once, happened twice. It happened a third time, and Aileen's colleague, Steve, stood up, and he said, "I think Aileen and I should switch seats." That was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. So a simple I statement. And why did he say that? Why did he do that? He did that for three reasons. The first is that he felt like he felt bad for Aileen. He cared about Aileen. He didn't like seeing her get ignored. The second reason he did it was that he just wanted to win the deal. And he knew if he couldn't get them listening to Aileen that they wouldn't win the deal. And the third reason he did it was that it was way more efficient for him to do it. If Aileen had done it, bias would have piled on top of bias. And so that is the idea of an I statement. An I statement just kind of holds a mirror up to the folks who are saying or doing the bias thing, and usually they self-correct. It's no big deal. Now, what about prejudice? If it is prejudice that you're confronting, holding a mirror up won't work, because the other person's going to grin in that mirror, and they're going to say, yeah, they're going to like what they see. So in the case of prejudice, you need an it statement. For example, my colleague, Trier Bryant, my co-founder, Trier Bryant, tells a story about being in a hiring meeting where they had interviewed 10 different candidates, and by far the most qualified candidate was a black woman who had worn her hair out naturally in the interview. And the hiring manager said, well, we can't move to offer with the most qualified candidate. And Trier said, why in the world not? And she said, well, we can't put that hair in front of the business. Believe me, nowhere in the hiring rec did it say anything about hair. This was an organization that was known for its very high hiring standards. And so what is an it statement? What could Trier say in such a situation? An it statement can appeal to the law. It is illegal not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was in that state because of the Crown Act. Or it can appeal to an HR policy. It is an HR violation not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was at that company. Or simply it can appeal to common sense. It is ridiculous not to hire the most qualified candidate because of their hair. So that is an it statement. Now, in the case of bullying, you need something different. You need a you statement. My daughter taught me this when she was in third grade. She was getting bullied on the playground, and I was encouraging her, as people often do, to use an I statement. I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah. She banged her fist on the table, and she said, Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded? I was like, that's a really good point. So in the case of bullying, what you as leaders need to do is use a you statement. You can't talk like that. Or a you question, what's going on for you here? Why are you doing this? Or simply, if you're in a situation where you feel like that might escalate the situation too much, simply change the subject. Where'd you get that shirt? The point of a you statement is that the other person is now answering your questions. You're no longer in the submissive role. So there's a lot more to say about all this, but what I want to do next is to think about what you all as leaders can do to make it more likely that people on your teams don't default to silence. If there's one thing I'd like to do, I'd like to end the default to silence, because these are the problems that are going to prevent your team from doing their best work. So let's go back to that bias story, to Aileen Lee at the table getting ignored. I had to think long and hard to think about a moment when someone was an upstander in that way. It's not what usually happens. I don't usually do it either. It's not like I'm holding myself up as the person who always gets this right. It is really hard to say something when you don't know what to say and when you're not even sure what's going on. So one of the things that you can do as leaders is you can create bias disruptors on your team. So there's 3, and this is fast. The idea of bias disruptors is you don't want to disrupt meetings, but you do want to disrupt the kind of biases that are going to get in the way of productive meetings. So bias disruptors, 3 parts. The first part is a shared vocabulary. Sit down and talk to your team. Don't impose words on your team, but talk to your team about what is the word or phrase that you all are most comfortable using to point out bias when it happens, to call people in. Trier and I use a purple flag. Other teams we've worked with use some throw up a peace sign. Others say bias alert. Some people like Daniel Kahneman's language. Whatever the words are that your team will most likely use in the moment, those are the right words to use. The second thing you need to do with your team is to teach people how to respond when their bias has been interrupted. Because I don't know about you, but when someone points out to me that I have said or done something that's biased, I feel deeply ashamed. I mean, it's one thing to have a growth mindset about math skills. It's another thing to have a growth mindset about bias. Because when I learn that I've been biased and I feel ashamed, I go into fight or flight mode, and I usually don't respond that well. I can tell you in my body where I feel shame. I feel it in the back of my knees, the same sensation that I feel if my children walk too close to the edge of a precipice. It is a real fear response, and everyone has it. So you got to teach your team how to respond well. So it's not that complicated. Thank you for pointing it out. I'll work on not doing it again. Or, thank you for pointing it out, but I don't quite know what I did wrong. And that is especially hard to say, because now I'm doubly ashamed. I'm ashamed because I've harmed someone, and I'm ashamed because I'm ignorant. I don't even know what I did wrong. But can we talk about it after the meeting? You don't have to talk about this in every meeting. You just want to flag it. And the reason why it's so important to flag it brings me to the third point. The third aspect bias disruptors is a shared commitment. So shared vocabulary, shared norm of how to respond, and a shared commitment. You got to commit to doing this at least once in every meeting, because I promise you, bias makes itself manifest in every single meeting that you have on your team every single day. And it doesn't mean the whole meeting is a disaster, but it is a pattern, and it is a flawed pattern. And if you don't correct the pattern, you reinforce it. This is why, in general, with Radical Candor, I say praise in public, criticize in private. But when it comes to bias, you've got to point it out publicly if you want to change the pattern. Okay, so that's bias. Next, prejudice. What can you do about prejudice on your teams? You need to have, and you don't have to call it a code of conduct, but you need to be explicit, and you want to do this before you're in crisis, before you're in base camp mode. I don't know if you all, I assume you read about that disaster, but you don't want to write your code of conduct when you're in the middle of a crisis. You want to explain to your team where the line is, and it's going to be different for every company. There's no absolute rule. But people can believe whatever they want. No matter how strong a leader you are, there's no such thing as the thought police. So you can't control people's beliefs. But they cannot say or do whatever they want. They cannot impose their beliefs on others. And where that line is between freedom to believe but not freedom to impose is going to be different. So you want to sort of explore that and explore that explicitly with your team so that people can use that it statement and refer to your policy. And last but not least, bullying. you've got to create consequences for bullying. I think this is actually the fundamental role of a leader, is to create consequences for bullying. Because bullying often gets results for the person, for the one individual, but it harms the collective results of the team. And as a leader, it's your job to make sure that the team achieves more collectively than any individual can do individually. So you want to create conversational consequences. You got to learn how to shut it down in the moment and to teach the people on your team how to use those use statements. You also want to create compensation consequences. If you reward people who indulge in bullying with high ratings, then you're just going to get more of it. It's going to escalate. When I was at Apple, we redesigned the system of ratings, and there were 3 things you got rated on. You got rated on your results, you got rated on your innovation, and you got rated on your teamwork. And when your teamwork was subpar, your overall rating was your teamwork rating. It didn't matter how good your results were. Last but not least, you got to create career consequences. If you promote, Atlassian has this policy, we do not promote the brilliant jerk. When the assholes begin to win, your company begins to lose, your culture begins to lose. So you've got to make sure that you're creating career consequences as well. So with that, I would love to shut up and take some questions from you all. Thank you so much. Don't be shy. Radical candor on radical candor. Radical candor on just work. Yeah?
So oftentimes in our business, the biggest innovators and disruptors are also the biggest assholes. And so how do you manage that situation where without that innovation and brilliance, you can't succeed?
Yeah.
But you all, you know where I'm going, so.
Yeah. In the immortal words of Steve Jobs, it's better to have a hole than an asshole. Now, he was one to talk, but in all seriousness, I think that there is a myth. There was one of the most talented people I ever worked with had this problem. He was incredibly innovative, but he really destroyed the people around him. And I gave him this feedback once, I gave him this feedback twice, I gave him this feedback a 3rd time. He was sort of ignoring me. And finally, I realized if I don't explain this to him in no uncertain terms, it's going to destroy his career, and his innovations are not worth anything because nobody can execute on them. And I went in to talk to him, and I realized that if he weren't emotionally distraught by the end of the meeting, that I would have failed to communicate with him. And he was incredibly upset by the end of the meeting. He was in tears. And not that I ever intend, it's not the goal, but I had to go way out on that challenge directly to make him understand what he was doing and how it was impacting those around him, but also how it was going to impact him. And he changed. And you know what? He went on to create one of the more successful companies that we've seen in the last decade. So I really believe that obnoxious aggression is preferable to ruinous empathy or manipulative insincerity, but it's still suboptimal. The people, even Steve Jobs, who didn't have a reputation as a kind and gentle, with his direct reports, with the people who worked very closely with him, Tim Cook offered him his liver, offered to give him a piece of his liver, and Steve rejected the challenge. I don't know of a word that explains that kind of sacrifice other than love, other than a real relationship. And so I think even the most talented people have got to form relationships with the people around them if they are going to be effective. Now, different people like different kinds of relationships, and not everyone loves to work with everyone else. But you've got to create the kind of environment in which your innovative people can work with people who enjoy working with them, who can be force multipliers for them. Otherwise, they're just not going to, they're going to be suboptimal. Other thoughts?
Hi there. So I think I'm lucky in that I love hiring. It's like probably one of my superpowers as a CEO, but 5% of people I hire, I would say, every time you try to give them radical candor, or what I believe I'm giving them as radical candor, it feels like they point to the feedback being as a result of one of these three things.
Yes.
And I sound like a fuddy-duddy, but all of these people tend to be under 30, and I just cannot fucking get through. And I end up, and they're smart people, but I end up having to let them go because it's like just poison to the organization. I'm curious whether you've encountered this or whether it's unique to me.
No, it's not unique to you at all. I think a couple of things. One is that encouraging people to be open to the feedback, just because there is a bias against women that they can't get away with being abrasive, does not mean that I am not sometimes abrasive, right? And so I think the first thing that you can do in that kind of situation is to bring in 5 or 6 or 7 examples of the problem that you're talking about and say, look, I see a pattern. And I promise at the end of this conversation, I'm going to give you an opportunity to explain why all of these examples of the pattern that I think I'm seeing are wrong. But I want you to sort of see the pattern that I'm seeing in your behavior and why it's problematic. And then you've got to give them a chance to share their perspective on the whole thing. And sometimes you're going to be proven right, but the best thing you can do to get people to be open to your feedback is to sometimes be proven wrong as well, and to celebrate it when you're wrong. To I used to have someone, for some reason, when I was at Google, gave me this big glass statue, a customer, and I adopted it as my "I was wrong, you're right" statue, and I go put it on people's desk. And so that shows that you're open. You want to really celebrate when you're open to feedback, when you're open to be proven wrong. But look, radical candor is it's not always going to work. Sometimes you're gonna wind up having to fire. If you're only firing 5% of your people, you're really doing remarkably well too. I mean, I always said if you get your hiring 50% right, you're batting above average. So you're not always going to hire the right people. But I think the key thing is to be open to the feedback, where sometimes it is. For example, I was working with a tech company, and they hadn't hired any women to the executive team. And so the CEO invited me into their promotion meeting because he figured that it was probably a problem with their promotion system, not with the women at the company. And so there were 2 people up for promotion, a man and a woman. And they both had great reputations. They both had built great teams, achieving great results. And they referred to the man as a real leader, and they referred to the woman as a real mother hen. And I was like, all right, guys, back the train up, I think we may have. And they were kind of, it doesn't mean anything. It's just, so I think showing that you're open, and in the end, they realized it did mean something. And they celebrated that. They talked about that. And so I think celebrating when you point out the bias is going to earn you the credibility that you need to say, no, this is not bias. No, this is not bullying. There's really a problem here. Does that make sense? Yeah?
Hi, Kim. It's great to see you. At some point, I bought your book for my entire company in the middle of the pandemic.
Thank you.
Yes. I need to.
All of you should do that, by the way.
We should do that again now that we've grown a little bit more. One thing I've been struggling with is I love to lead with empathy and understanding. And there are some things that are happening in my employees' lives that are beyond my control. Something at home with their kids, with their parents, and they're just not in a good place. What advice do you have with dealing with those types of situations?
Yeah, this is really hard, especially now. I think that when what I try to do in that situation is when somebody's in a temporary situation that's going to last, 2 weeks, a month, maybe 2 months, you cut them all the slack in the world. But if somebody's in a permanent situation where they cannot do the job that you need for them to do, it is not an act of kindness for them or for the team around them to allow them to continue doing that job. So you want to be as compassionate as you can about finding another role where they can succeed at your company or another role somewhere else where they can succeed. It is, because it's when you know that you can't contribute, it is stressful. I mean, at least I found in the pandemic, when things were maximally stressful, that one of the things that helped people more than anything else was to do work that they could control, that was useful. And so that's kind of is it temporary? Is it a couple of months? Can you afford to cut them some slack? If it's permanent, you can't afford to cut them slack infinitely. But you can help them find a better place. I know we're over time. I can keep going, or last question? Okay, last question.
We're building a remote-first team, as I'm sure many people are. And in the past, as we went to going remote, we had relationships with people, and so it was easier to have these conversations. In person, it almost feels more natural to have these conversations.
Yeah.
But there's people that, I spend 30 minutes a week on Zoom, and 95% of my comms is, via Slack. How do you build the relationship so that you can actually have these conversations, or maybe even how do you have these conversations effectively over Zoom or something, or the phone, versus sitting them down and pulling them aside?
Yeah, tons more to say about this. I'm going to be fast. One thing is, make sure at the beginning of team meetings that you're leaving a little bit of time for chit-chat, because we don't have these sort of natural crossovers. So leave time for people to explain what they're coming into the meeting with, so that they know what's going on for one another. I think that helps build relationships. It also is more efficient, because very often I'll come onto a Zoom and I'm scowling and everybody thinks I'm pissed off at them and I hate them, and really I'm scowling because my dog just pooped on the rug. And if I have a moment to say that, then everything goes more smoothly. And then we bond a little bit. The second thing I would say is, remember, you want to have these conversations synchronously. Do not give feedback over Slack. Slack is a disaster for feedback, or email, or text, or anything else. You want to have these conversations synchronously, and very often the phone is better than a video call. When you're sitting, I say, if you're in person, don't sit across from the table, because that often is confrontational and seen as aggressive. You want to take a walk. So take a walk, to have a phone call. Adam Grant has written a lot about this. I'll send you the link. But now I want to thank you. I'm over time. Really enjoyed the conversation.